Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Live Free, Ride Free. I'm your host, Rupert Isaacson, New York Times bestselling author of The Horse Boy and The Long Ride Home. Before I jump in with today's guest, I want to say a huge thank you to you, our audience, for helping to make this happen. I have a request. If you like what we do here, please give it a thumbs up, like, subscribe, tell a friend. It really, really helps us to make the progress. To find out about our certification courses, online video libraries, books, and other courses, please go to rupertisaacson.com. So now let's jump in. Okay, I realize that I have not really given a good recounting of why this Live Free, Ride Free idea came about and what my own journey was here. So I'm just going to take an opportunity in between my fascinating guests to give you guys a bit of an update on what brought me here. What's my own trajectory of self-actualization? So the idea came for this website, this podcast from a trip to Yellowstone National Park in 14, when my son Kirian was still inside Ileana's abdomen. But we were taking Rowan, my oldest son, who many of you know from The Horse Boy, on this trip to see wolves in Yellowstone as part of a project that he had going at the time called Endangerous, about animals that are both endangered and dangerous. And we wanted to look at the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone. Amazing trip. And we went in March and it was all snowed up. So you can imagine how iconic it was to see the wolves against the snow and to share this with one child born and really coming into the light, because Rowan was, coming out of those years of severe autism and really into this total engagement with the world, and another child unborn, and all of that adventure going through his mother, excuse me, into him. And it was in the course of walking a trail. I think we were actually snowshoeing, Ileana being very pregnant at the time, where we came up with this idea of talking to people who had lived self-actualized lives, because we had just run into a guy called Rick McIntyre, who many of you may know wrote best-selling books about the wolf reintroductions in Yellowstone. And we had just met him and interviewed him sort of there on the side of the road. And I was thinking, gosh, this is a guy who's really lived a self-actualized life. And by the way, he's going to be a guest on this show. And I thought, yeah, but there's so many people out there doing this. And also so many people out there just wondering how to live through their dreams and manifest the reality that they want. So that's where the idea for this podcast came. And it took a few years for it to come to fruition, but now here it is. And of course, we're talking to all these incredible people who do all these incredible things, some of whom are well known and some of whom are not. But my story, all right. So that's where the idea came. But my own story is this. I'll just sort of go through the biography, really. I was born in London in 1967 to two parents from Southern Africa. My father's from Zimbabwe, was then Rhodesia. My mother is South African. And it was an interesting family because it was one that sat really at the crossroads of many cultures. On my dad's side, we were Ashkenazi Jews, originally from Lithuania, who had emigrated to Africa on one side, almost by mistake, it goes the legend, and on the other side by design. I'll return to that story in a minute because it's funny. On my mother's side, they'd been out there since, I think, the late 18th, very early 19th century, part English, part Scottish, part Dutch Afrikaans. And in the course of the few hundred years of living there, the family, of course, spread out through society. And we were kind of represented out there in Southern Africa at kind of every level, from really, really poor. There was a sort of poor white class, right up to sort of almost a blue blood class there. And we also had a whole side of the family that, well, still today is not white, is of mixed race, which in South Africa they call colored. And that's still an official designation. That's not necessarily a racist term. People refer to themselves that way. And so we had family that were kind of the evil architects of apartheid. We had family who were in jail because they were fighting against apartheid. We had family who were not white. We had family who were Jewish. We had family that were Afrikaans speaking. We had family that were only English speaking. And I grew up in this household in North London where my parents had moved in the 60s with this kind of constant procession of all these different characters coming through the house, and Afrikaans often being spoken in the house, and everything on the walls, all the furniture and all the artifacts and objects around the house, all being kind of Southern African. So it's a weird bubble of this kind of culture within North London. And there was a certain amount of back and forth to Africa as well. So I grew up very much seeing these, as I said, crossroads of cultures, and I was connected to them all. I was part of them all, but I wasn't fully any one of those things. And at a very young age, that didn't matter. When I hit my teens, I felt a great sense of needing to belong and wishing that I could belong and not belonging really anywhere. And took me a while to see that that actually was a place of power, that that crossroads of cultures allows you to take from each one what is good, leave alone what is not good. And it means that while it's true you don't quite belong anywhere, you also sort of belong everywhere. And if you think of yourself as a citizen of the planet, that's actually a very real position to be in, rather than to feel, well, I'm rooted in one culture. But I was lucky enough to be connected to many different cultures. Okay, so that was the Southern African side. Then I also had this great love for horses. It was kind of born into me, and there've been lots of cavalry officers in the past in the family, and sometimes it skips a generation. A lot of you who are horsey listeners will know this. So my parents are not horsey at all, but I had a great aunt who, my mother's aunt, South African again, who had married into an English horsey family up in a place called Leicestershire, which is about an hour and a half north of London. And she had old retired horses, and we used to go up and spend weekends frequently at that farm. And I was just always to be found from the age of about 3, just sitting in the field talking to the horses. And my parents were very, very urban, so they were not sympathetic to the idea that maybe I would want to ride. But my great aunt said, that boy, he's going to ride. And my parents were like, no, 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 we're not going to. And they're like, no, he will. You'll see. So in the event, she was right. But before we get to that, there was another aspect of my childhood which I think has helped to fuel this whole adventure, which is that I had this deep, deep, deep craving and longing for nature. My parents lived and still live in an area of London that is incredibly urban. It's right in the middle. It's called Islington. It's quite a handsome area, but it's by no means, you know, connected to nature as we would like to think of it ideally, open fields, forests. No. There's actually, oddly enough, quite a lot of wildlife in it, urban foxes, that sort of thing. But it's very built up. And where I was sent to school was right in the middle of the financial district of London. So concrete, concrete, and more concrete. So I had this burning desire to get out, to get into nature, to get on horseback. And at the same time, I was drafted into a choir, a singing choir. And the school that I went to, which is called, still exists today, the City of London School. It's an ancient school. It was founded 600 years ago or so. It provides the boys for both the Chapel Royal, which is the King's Chapel, and the temple. which is where the Knights Templar were based in London. It's the second oldest building in London. And it's steeped in lore. The Magna Carta sits there. The tombs of the old Knights Templar, the Marshall family, they're all there, with the effigies of the knights on top of them. You think it sounds kind of Hogwarts-ish, but it wasn't. It was just all rather unpleasant and nasty and actually quite violent. If you've read The Lord of the Flies, where the boys in that story, they're from a choir and they get stranded on a desert island and, revert to a not very nice way of treating each other. It was a bit like that. And the reason was there wasn't a lot of really good adult supervision. So between the school itself, which was in the heart of the sort of brutal financial district in terms of the aesthetics, and then the school itself was quite brutal because we were the last generation of boys to be regularly beaten at school. And then the choir, which, although on the face of it was all very, very clean cut and lovely, there was lots of nasty violence behind the scenes. And this great longing to get out and get into nature. I had a nervous breakdown. And in this nervous breakdown, I guess I was 11. I couldn't get out of bed for about 3 months or more, 6 months maybe. And I was deeply upset and sort of overwhelmed, unable to function. And what got me out of bed was horses. At that point, my parents really listened to me. And I said, look, I think this would help me. So that's how I ended up getting riding lessons. And it was true. It brought me out of bed and into the light and out into nature. And it was literally as if a switch had been flicked. I'd had all sorts of, medical examinations and so on, and no one could find the cause of, why I had no energy and so on and so on. But as soon as horses were brought into the picture, boom, there I was, right as rain. So that began my equestrian life. Now, I wanted a horse, and that, of course, presented its own set of issues and challenges. So the deal I made with my folks was that if I could raise the money, we could get one and keep it at my aunt's farm, even though that was a couple of hours north of London. And I would just go up there every weekend and all holidays and just live that life and be there and be useful on the farm. Because by then I was getting a bit bigger, a bit stronger, useful for shoveling poo and doing all the myriad endless chores that are needed around a farm. So I got a gig, a sort of self-created gig. So my sort of beginning of entrepreneurship, really. I used to go, it occurred to me that if I were to empty all the crap that was in our neighbors' garages that they always wanted to get rid of but never could, and took it up to a local flea market in North London at a place called Swiss Cottage, which doesn't exist anymore, the flea market there. It's all become too gentrified now, but back then in the late 70s, early 80s, it did. And I could sell at the weekends all this old kind of rubbish, really, at very, very cheap prices, that eventually I could make enough money to buy a horse. So for 2 years, every weekend, I sat in my own market stall, aged between 12 and 14, and I flogged as much gear as I could get out of all the garages in the neighborhood. And I did actually make enough money from this to buy a horse. And the horse that I bought was a horse off the racetrack. That's how you get cheap horses. He was cheap, and there was a reason he was cheap. He was not very manageable, and he scared the bejesus out of me. And I had to learn to ride well quite quickly. I had been taking lessons, of course, for a couple of years at this point, but this was a whole other level. And luckily for me, there was someone who could mentor me, who was living on the farm, and she was a radiographer who was also horsey, who exchanged she was called Trudy, and she exchanged living in the farm cottage and doing the horses and other work through the week before and after work in return for free rent. And then I, at the weekend, the deal was would take over the chores when I came up, which I did. And she was quite knowledgeable, and she showed me how to retrain and make manageable this extremely hot, unmanageable horse, who actually taught me so much that that was what set me on my professional track with horses. Because if you can learn to manage a horse like this, who would do all kinds of crazy stuff, but was also brilliantly talented in many ways, if you could learn to handle a horse like this in the competition arena and in out in the hunt field, it's a big fox hunting area, then you could kind of train any horse. Any other horse after this would be kind of easy. So he really set me on my professional path, even though I didn't know it at the time. So that was sort of my boyhood of having these dreams and thinking, how do I possibly manifest my way out of being in the middle of the city, not having access to nature, wishing that I could ride and be with horses, wishing myself into a more sensory, not just sensory friendly, but let's say sensory possible environment. And by hook and by crook, quite early in my life, I manifested this. And when I'm thinking back, remember where we started with my African family constantly coming through, I would hear all these different perspectives on life. And I would see how the people who were fighting against apartheid and who were the sort of freedom fighters within the family were consistently gaining ground. They were always further ahead each time one met them. And the people who were within the family who were more resistant to that were always losing ground. And I realized quite early, oh, I see, nature, the world, the universe wants harmony. Injustice, it doesn't last. It can go on for quite a long time, but always the world is going to return to harmony if it can. Harmony is the natural state. And somehow this really came into me, I think, through the constant arguments and just that all these different sides of the family constantly brought. Because a lot of my non-white family too, by the way, they couldn't go to university in the good universities in South Africa because of apartheid. So they would come to the UK and do that. And of course, they would stay with us in our house in London and so on. So I really did get all these different perspectives. Okay. And so that people could create their own realities if they wanted to. Into the bargain, there was also always this spiritual side where the earliest memories that I've got are of walking in the garden. I think I must have been between 3 and 5, somewhere there, maybe even younger. Maybe it's hard to tell, but I'm very, very young, and it's a sunlit garden. I'm up early on a summer morning, and none of the adults are awake, so I'm walking in the garden, and there are bees buzzing. There's flowers growing out of the brick wall. There's sun on the brick wall. And somehow I can hear God talking through those bees and those flowers. And the message is very reassuring. The message is, you are loved. Everyone is love. Everything is love. And I had little reminders of this all the way through my boyhood. I remember being in the school chapel, and even though school was not nice, as I had talked about, there was this sign on on the wall of the chapel, as there often is in these things, said, "God is love and love is God." And I remember having this deep, resonant relationship with just that little text on the wall of that chapel. This is absolute truth. Yes, this is truth. God is love and love is God. And somehow, even in the darkest time of that breakdown period, I never felt abandoned by God or by the universal love. It felt more like a descent into the underworld, like a journey into the underworld that needed to be made in order to come out into the light, into another place, a better place. Then I also frequently would have this recurring dream of being in a place where there was threat and danger, even a sense of being hunted, and being able to manifest a doorway, a portal that took me immediate, and sometimes me and people I loved, immediately out and away and into this other dimension in which was pure safety, pure love, and this feeling of great relief and joy and surprise, but also not surprise, this feeling of more like a return home. And this dream came up constantly through my childhood. So all of these elements sort of came parallel. And I remember too, when I was about 7 on a trip back to Africa, seeing on my grandfather's farm, my grandfather was not a particularly nice man. He was one of the people on the reactionary end of the family. But there were lots and lots of people working on his farm and a big cattle farm. In the compound where all the workers lived, there was a witch doctor at work, what they called an inganga. And I remember seeing a healing happen at about 7 years old, big ritual, and the drums going all night and the people dancing all night and the inganga laying hands on the sick one. And again, having this feeling of, oh, I see, there are more ways to healing, there are more ways to love than we might think. And even though all the grown-ups were just like, oh, that's just some superstition, that's just what these people do, I could see that people were getting better, getting sick and getting better through this. And it helped me to think, yes, you can look for alternatives within the spirit world. In fact, you should always look for alternatives within the spirit world as much as you look for anything within the material world. So all of these things sort of came together very much when I was a boy. And then a lot of these family stories too, from previous generations, this idea of ancestry and ancestors. So I had said that there's a funny story that on my father's side, the people going to Africa, one of them had ended up there by mistake. The family law was that my great uncle Harry Shapiro, Herschel Shapiro, had actually run away from his wife Minnie in Lithuania and had gotten on a boat to, he wanted to go to the USA, but it turned out he got on the wrong boat and he ended up on a boat to Port Elizabeth in South Africa. So he kind of went, oh, well, and learned English on the way down. And when he arrived there, he realized that there was, well, he'd heard, I suppose, on the voyage about all the findings of the gold fields and the diamond mines, which were all happening around that time in the late 19th century. So he was thinking, well, maybe I could get up there and make my fortune. But as he arrived in Africa, the Boer War broke out and he found himself drafted into the English army in Port Elizabeth, and he joined the Johannesburg Mounted Rifles, even though it was 1,000 miles from Johannesburg, and there was, no horses. And he tramped up and down South Africa for 2 or 3 years without seeing a shot fired, luckily for him, and then ended up in Johannesburg where the mines were. But of course, they'd already been taken over by big, corporations. So he ended up getting a job in the kitchens as a butcher. And his wife managed to track him down and find him there. So he was making a bit of money eventually by buying and selling cattle as part of the butchery thing. And then he ran away again up to the newly formed at that point colony of Rhodesia, what is now Zimbabwe, and began to deal in cattle up there in this sort of slightly Wild West atmosphere. Then his wife Minnie tracked him down again, and he then capitulated and they stayed together. And he had a daughter, Frida, who was my grandmother. My grandfather, Robbie, who married her, his parents had come out to Africa also from Lithuania, and their name was Schmiekovic. And they changed their name when they got to German Southwest Africa, what is now Namibia, the young colony of German Southwest Africa at that point, because they were German speaking. And they hoped to integrate more into the German society there. So they changed their name to Isaacson. With the logic there, I don't see. I mean, von Neuenberg or something Isaacson is like you go from one Jewish thing to another Jewish thing. And of course, they found that it was a bit too anti-Semitic there. And so my grandfather, Robbie, in the 1920s, went across to Rhodesia and joined the company, the cattle auctioneering company that my great uncle Harry had by then founded. Sorry, great great uncle. And married Frida and eventually took over that company. And that was his life, cattle ranching and so on. On my mother's side, the family stories were very, very strong. So on the Scottish side, we had cousins who had, ancestor cousins who had fought at the Battle of Culloden. If any of you know your Scottish history, we've been watching Outlander. That was the big battle in which the British finally smashed up the Scottish clans because they just couldn't deal with any more civil wars happening on British soil. They were trying to build the empire, and they're like, okay, we've had enough now. There'd been plenty of these uprisings. We're gonna just really smack them. And they did. And they smashed the clans at Culloden. And then there was something called the Highland Clearances, where they basically put them all on boats and sent them to either to the Americas or Australia, which is why we have, a lot of Scots influence in Appalachia and, Celtic influence in music there, also Irish settlers, and of course out in Australia as well. And in that battle, our family were the Clark family, who were part of Clan Macpherson, who of course fought on the wrong side, fought on the Scottish side. And Macpherson himself didn't do so well after that. But we had another cousin on the English side at the same time called Judge Jeffreys, who hanged all of our cousins on the Scottish side. So again, it's this sort of weird dichotomy within the family ancestral line of goodies and baddies and really knowing these stories. And then that was the Scottish line. On the English line, there were four brothers who went out from a village called Loxton, which is, you can see it on a sign off the M5 if you're driving in southwest England, in Somerset. The Loxton brothers and Loxton, four brothers went out from the village of Loxton, same name, and went to make their fortunes. And this was during this depression which happened in England after the Napoleonic Wars, where the old wartime economy had crashed and, things were not looking so good for a lot of people. So out they went. Three went to South Africa, one went to Australia, and there is to this day a town of Loxton in South Africa and a town of Loxton in Australia. So they were busy guys. They got involved in things and, became adventurers and business people. And one of them, another great great uncle, Henry Loxton, did an interesting thing. He went north of the Orange River, which at that time was the northern boundary between like civilized land and the great African hinterland of, danger and mystery beyond. And at the time, there was something happening called the Umfakani. And the Umfakani, some people call it the Diffakani, was the explosion of the Zulu Empire, in which the Zulus kind of went on a massive, killing spree across southern Africa, subjugating all the other tribes they could find. A bit like, the Huns and the Mongols when they exploded out. Very, very warlike people, very, very organized. And the British wanted to keep the Zulus and the sort of all these tribes who are being displaced out of the British zone south of the Orange River. So there were a bunch of escaped slaves of mixed race. They were called the Koranas, the Bastar, literally meaning bastards, the Kwa, and some other related groups who were of mixed race. And they had run away from the British and Dutch Cape Colony and created their own sort of free, mounted on horseback, but sort of piratical raiding cultures along the north bank of the Orange River. And the British made a deal with them and said, look, you guys can operate up here and you can live on these fertile islands in the Orange River because it's desert on either side. And we'll kind of leave you alone, provided you kind of act as a buffer zone, like a military buffer zone between the farming areas south of that and the great beyond. And that deal was struck. These groups, Griquas, Bastas, Karanas, were organized militarily under the leadership of what were called captains, literally captains, Afrikaans speaking, but not white. And my great great uncle Henry fell in love with the daughter of one of these bastard captains, a woman called Anna Boysens. And he stayed up there and had children with her. And of course, that meant he was, and that side of the family was then forever cut off. Remember, this is 150 years ago from the white side of the family further south. But what he did was quite clever. He managed to get a deal brokered between the Cape government, basically directly with Queen Victoria through official channels, for his family to retain that land along those islands in the Orange River in perpetuity. And to this day, the Loxton family still farm cattle and wine in that area and are non-white to this day. And under apartheid, they managed to resist every attempt to move them, because under apartheid, all the good areas were taken for whites, and all the not so good areas, that's where the non-whites were shunted into. And they managed to hold on to it because of this old ratified deed. And in fact, the apartheid government even tried to get my family there to reclassify themselves as white so that the government wouldn't lose face by letting them stay there. But my family on that side said, no, no, we're colored and we're going to stay colored. We're not going to be white. We're not white. And they managed to hold on and survive just through like sheer grit. But why is all this important? Because all this informs the next point in my life. So I finished school. I take a year off. I travel, I work. I spend a lot of time in the States, and I get into training horses in the States in my year off. I go to university in York in England and I study history. And I started with archaeology and then I go to history. And while I'm at university, I pay my way by riding horses on movie sets. We have a family friend who's a stuntman, and he managed to get me a union card. And I used to manage to make enough money to pay my rent and travel by working on these movie sets. And if any of you have seen the film Willow, that you'll see me quite a lot in that one, hanging out in various backgrounds of battle scenes, riding horses around, but many films from the late 80s and TV stuff with horses. All right. And I'm in Africa quite a lot through each summer, just traveling, hitchhiking around, experiencing it. While I'm down there, aged 19, because I went to university quite young. I finished school at 17, went up to university at 18. I'm 19 and I'm in one of my summer travels. I'm in Africa and I hitchhike from Zimbabwe across into Botswana. I've got cousins in Botswana, and my cousin Frank meets me at the sort of roadhead where I've come in. And at that time, it was before the big diamond thing really took off in Botswana. So it was still very, 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 very remote and poor, and just donkey carts and, people really living at survival level. And he was pioneering out there, my cousin Frank Taylor, something called agroforestry, which is now a thing, but no one had heard of it then. Dryland agroforestry. And he was finding groups of Bushman hunter-gatherers who'd been displaced, usually by more aggressive cattle-owning tribes. And all the game had been shot out, and all the wild foods had been, eaten by cattle. And these people were destitute. And he got them to put up fences, and then inside those fences plant the wild foods that normally they would have gathered. And he started finding a market for these. If you've ever seen the product Devil's Claw, which people use for arthritis a lot, my cousin Frank Taylor was the first person to get that onto the international market. And so he's a very, very Christian man and quite quite dour, quite scary, big, tall, lean, rangy, piercing blue eyes, sort of, dude. And when he picked me up and he was driving me out to his place on that trip, he said, "Where in your spiritual journey are you, Rupert?" And it was the first time anyone had asked me that. And what was weird is I'd had a dream just not so long before that. In the dream, I'd met the devil, and the devil was this man playing a violin, standing on a hillside, and had sort of let me know that there were choices to be made and in the world. And I said, okay, well, I don't know where I am in my spiritual journey, Frank, but if it's any use, I had this dream, not so long ago. And he said, yes, you're going to be tested, sort of thing. And if you get tested and you want to go towards the light, you can always expect resistance from the dark. And this is normal, and, but just pay attention to this. And so I thought, well, that's interesting, because, no one I know back in England, ever talks like that. And okay, didn't think much more of it. Go back to university, graduate. And then afterwards, I'm like, well, what do I want to do? I thought, well, what I really want to do is write. I always loved stories, always loved storytelling. I guess that's something I left out, was I'd always been an avid reader, and I'd started experimenting with writing and storytelling in my mid-teens. And I, through university, put out or wrote a group of short stories, and they never got published, but I found an agent in London who was actually interested in them, and he said, look, if you were to take a bit more of a perfectionist approach and actually edit these things properly, they're kind of publishable. So, you should think about this. So I thought, well, maybe I'd like to write. And all my friends at that point were going off into corporate jobs, many of them in banking, and immediately starting to make a lot of money. I didn't do that. I went out to North America again to horse train and to see if I could begin to establish myself as a writer. And I was also in love. I was deeply in love with a girl from Canada who we'd had an idyllic time for 1 year, and then through various events had broken up, and she dumped me once, and then we gotten back together again. And then I went out to North America largely to follow her. And it was all completely crazy. I had no work permit, no nothing. But I had, connections in the horse world. So I went out, started training horses in Virginia, and then ended up going up to Toronto, where she was, hoping that she would sort of take me back and that somehow I'd sort of become a writer in this. And it was winter. And she said, no, actually, I'm dumping you. And so I'm like, oh, okay, well, I guess I have a choice. I can either go back to England, or I can take the adventure. And I had this gut feeling, Rupert, take the adventure. You should take the adventure, no matter how difficult it is. As you know, if you followed any of my work, I'm an autism dad, and we have a whole career before this podcast in helping people with neurodivergence, either who are professionals in the field. Are you a therapist? Are you a caregiver? Are you a parent? Or are you somebody with neurodivergence? When my son Rowan was diagnosed with autism in 2004, I really didn't know what to do. So I reached out for mentorship, and I found it through an amazing adult autistic woman who's very famous, Dr. Temple Grandin. And she told me what to do. And it's been working so amazingly for the last 20 years that not only is my son basically independent, but we've helped countless thousands of others reach the same goal, working in schools, working at home, working in therapy settings. If you would like to learn this cutting-edge neuroscience-backed approach, it's called Movement Method. You can learn it online. You can learn it very, very simply. It's almost laughably simple. The important thing is to begin. Let yourself be mentored, as I was, by Dr. Grandin, and see what results can follow. Go to this website,
newtrailslearning.com. Sign up as a gold member. Take the online movement method course. It's in 40 countries. Let us know how it goes for you. We really want to know. We really want to help people like me, people like you out there live their best life, to live free, ride free, see what happens.
So I did, and I survived by snow shoveling and working on construction sites and finding whatever under the table work I could. And I managed to find shelter to live in an old museum, a private museum, where the guy who ran it let me sleep under a glass case full of sea turtle skulls on a bedroll for a while. And I managed to kind of survive my way through that winter. And then at the same time, I began to write and place my first published articles in magazines, which I'd sent off to editors and managed to get them published. Stuff about horses, stuff about travel, stuff about experiences in Africa. And I thought, wow, actually, I guess I could do this. So I then moved from Toronto up to Montreal and managed to find a gig as a window cleaner. And that actually paid not so bad money. And we were living in abandoned buildings and squatting in abandoned warehouses. So we could survive. I by then had a group of friends. We were all doing this together. This is the 90s. Lots of rock and roll, lots of partying, lots of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and getting by. I found out while I was doing this about a story that was unfolding in northern Quebec, where the Cree Indians were under threat of having an area the size of France, of that land, the size of Quebec alone is the size of Western Europe, right? An area the size of France flooded in order to create hydropower. It's a government company called Hydro-Quebec was going to do this, to sell that electricity to New York and the New England states. And the threat to the people up there was existential. It was basically, that would have been kind of the end of them. And they were still people that lived really traditionally, hunting caribou and moose, trapping beaver, fur trapping, also trapping for meat, and living under canvas in teepees, even in the midst of the winter. And northern Canada, the winters, I mean, you might think you know winter, but until you've been up there, it's just like, it's a whole other thing. And I got wind of this story, and that the Cree Indians had actually had a previous run-in back in the 70s with Hydro-Quebec. And although they'd lost, they'd been given a big government settlement. And they were clever. They'd used this money partly to send a lot of their kids away to law school, so that, because they knew it would happen again. And so that now it had happened again, they had a whole bunch of lawyers who were Cree and who were busy fighting this. I said, this is a fascinating story. And it was all over all the papers in Canada all the time, because it was a big, like, native Canadian versus, the establishment story. And I realized that nobody back in the UK or Europe at all was reporting on this. But it was huge, because if the thing went through, it was going to cause, the volume of water was going to cause, that was being shifted, was going to cause the Earth's crust to shift. And that was going to release, all these scientists were saying, massive amounts of mercury from the bedrock that would not just poison everything up there, but poison everything, downstream of there, including, water in New England and the Great Lakes and all this. So I managed to get up there to that area, and I published the story. And that's an easy thing to say, but when you're a homeless window cleaner, to publish a story in a big national paper is not easy. What happened was I called a big national newspaper in the UK, the Independent on the Sunday Independent, and I said, look, you don't know me. I'd like to get up there and do this story for you. And they said, we do indeed not know you. But it is an interesting story. If you can bring something back that's publishable, let's see. So I had to take a punt on it, and it's incredibly expensive to get up into these areas. Me and a friend, a photographer friend, went up. It's not just once you're up there, you have to get like planes into these areas. There's no roads, and snowmobiles and stuff. I don't have this money, but I managed to contact the tribal council and say, look, I would like to try to get this, into the British press. I can't guarantee that I'll publish it, but would you help me have a go? And they did. And when me and my friend Ryan arrived up there, and we were living, in the winter in Montreal, which is damn cold, in all our winter gear, and they looked at us and they said, "Where's your winter gear?" And we're like, "Well, we're wearing it." And they just laughed at us, took us off, kitted us out with caribou skin parkas, moose skin mittens, halfway up the arm, and moose skin boots up to the top of the thigh. And then you get on these snowmobiles and out you go really fast. And the wind chill factor, it's like even you've only got this much of your skin exposed because you've got goggles and you've got balaclava. It's like someone takes a hot knife and just puts it to you there. Incredibly cold. And we managed, we were allowed to see, privileged to see this life, this traditional life, really unchanged. People were using snowmobiles and people were using rifles, but people were living off the forest under canvas in their tribal system and holding to their culture and holding to the ecology and looking after the ecology, not just for themselves, but for us, because they were protecting us from all getting poisoned with mercury. And I managed to get a story back to the UK and I got it published. And that was my breakthrough. It also let me see something about manifestation, because although all the odds were against the Cree winning this land claim, they won. They managed to persuade New York and all of the states that were going to buy this hydropower to not buy it in advance, and the government shut the project down. It was an extraordinary landmark win. And it made me realize, oh my gosh, you really can win against the odds like that. Okay. So I end up back in England because, there's only so long you can exist as an under the table homeless window cleaner. And by then I'd had my first thing published. So I went back and I began to work on newspapers and magazines. And I ended up co-founding a very short-lived magazine about ecology and hunting together. It's called International Field Sports and Conservation, or IFC. But it was operational for a couple of years and we managed to get national distribution, and I got to see what it was like to actually run, edit, sell the advertising, bootstrap up something that could go like international news agents, and you could buy it wherever. And we had to do everything. We had to write the copy, sell the advertising, design everything up for the printers, get it to the printers, learn about color offset printing, blah, 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 raise the money from issue to issue. And although in the end it did fold but it only folded after about 2 years. And it again made me realize that you can do these things. And of course, I was at the same time still always horse training on the side. Right about the time that it folded, I got a job to go and write a guidebook to South Africa. And at the time, that was just when South Africa, it's 1992, this is just when South Africa did the changeover finally from apartheid to black rule. And everyone had been boycotting traveling there for, decades. And now suddenly it was going to open up to tourism. So get out there and write the first guidebook. So I did, for a guidebook company called Cadogan, who don't exist anymore, but who did really beautifully illustrated guides, and similar to The Lonely Planet, or rough guides, but much more beautifully produced and with more of an emphasis on culture. And I went out and basically lived in my car in South Africa and Namibia for about a year and a half, or a year, year and a half. And of course, I spent a lot of time in Africa before, so that's why I got the job. I knew the place quite well. But this was different because I had to see it in real detail. And of course, the guidebook job itself didn't pay enough to fully live on. So because I'd published this first big story, I managed to get journalistic assignments to go out and cover, the changeover of apartheid into black rule. And it was an incredibly violent year in Africa. And I'd never had any bad experiences in Africa, even when I was hitchhiking around before and I'd run into, you know, armed areas where there was civil war going on. And even when I was very young at 7, we'd been out there during the War of Independence, but it hadn't really touched us, except having to go around in, armored armored convoys and things. But this year it did. Oh my gosh, did it. I got several direct assaults on my life in a really short period of time. In about a 6-week period, I had about as many really violent episodes in which I either had to fight, plead, hide, or run, or take a massive beating, not knowing if I was going to be killed or not. And I didn't know what post-traumatic stress disorder was back then. But when I had completed that year and came back to England to write the thing up and deliver it, I was just jumpy as all hell and getting all these weird viral diseases and like colds all the time and flus and things. And I never got that. I was always like so robust and, having fights with my girlfriend and getting into fights in pubs and things like that. Stuff I just never did. All classic symptoms of PTSD. Fortunately for me, at the time, I was riding semi-professionally so I always had this parallel track with horse training for a lady outside London, eventing. And so, of course, what I was doing was I was getting up from the place in London that I was renting, getting on my bicycle. This is most days, cycling across London to Paddington Station through all the traffic, and then getting on a train, going out into the countryside, cycling again out to the farm, saddling up, being with the horses, being out in nature with the horses, then going home. What I didn't know then was what I was doing is I was filling myself with something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which you get when you move and problem solve, and it creates new neural pathways, and oxytocin, the feel good and communication healing hormone, by being with the horses all the time. So slowly I healed from the PTSD of all these really violent incidents. I had a guy climb through my window with a kitchen knife in his hand, and what followed there was not nice, and so on. So I recovered. And although I didn't quite know why, there's a little part of me that clocked it and went, just hold on to this knowledge, but I didn't quite know why. And I'd also had another really interesting spiritual experience out in Africa that year, where I'd been on Table Mountain and I had gotten a fever and been delirious and had this revelation back to the God is love, love is God thing. I'd remembered that up on Table Mountain. And then I realized, oh, well, if that's true, and that is true, and if everything is God, then everything must be love. So the shirt that I'm wearing, the cotton fibers of it must be actually made of love. Matter must be love. And even the car, the metal of the car that I'm driving and the fuel that's running it, which is made from fossil forests, is actually all love. So everything is love. And this base faith had also, I think, kept me going through this time of great fear that I'd undergone out there that in that violent year. I then got another job right after that to go and do a guidebook in India. And India, as anyone knows who's ever spent a long time out there, because when you go write a guidebook, you've got to really immerse yourself in those. You're out there for a long time. India will change you because it's incredibly spiritual, and at the same time, it's really brutal. People are just horrible to each other. And at the same time, it's so sublime and the spirituality is actually very pure. It's both at the same time. It makes you really have to become comfortable with ambiguity, that things are both dark and light together. And that is useful because that is just sort of how life is. It's just pumped through a really amplified lens when you're out there. I came back from India and got another job in Africa. It was while doing this other guidebook that I began to hear a story about a group of Bushmen, Kalahari San Bushmen, hunting and gathering peoples, who had been in South Africa under apartheid and had been kicked out of a national park, what's now the second biggest national park in South Africa, the Kalahari National Park, on the border of Botswana and Namibia. They'd been kicked out in the 70s when the park had been created and been living by the side of the road ever since. And what was interesting was the Bushmen were a big part of my family mythology, in that that great uncle I told you about before, who'd gone north of the Orange River, he had spent a lot of time interacting with the Khoisan. And my grandfather, who was a journalist, had also spent quite a lot of time up there with them. And everyone who'd gone up there in the family had always sort of reported back, these are just the purest people. These are the best people in the world. They don't make war. They're like a sort of almost like an elusive fairy folk. And there's always this sort of mythology about these people. And part of that mythology was that there were none of them left in South Africa. They'd all been wiped out at the end of the 19th century. And, if you wanted to find those people, you had to go up to very remote parts of Botswana or Namibia, much deeper into the Kalahari Desert. Well, it turned out that no, there were actually Bushmen living in South Africa all along. They'd just been displaced, but a very, very small group of them had left, just literally an extended family. Around that time, too, I ran into my first group of San Bushmen up in Namibia. Literally, I'd found out where to go. I'd finally been able to get my hands on a 4x4, and they're very expensive, and driven out to this place called Nyai in eastern Namibia, and parked under a big baobab tree. And two Bushmen had walked out of the thickets, and one of them spoke English, a guy called Benjamin. And he said, yeah, I can absolutely introduce you into the culture a little bit. You've made it all this way. And I had my first taste of that life, of that hunting and gathering life that still exists up there. And seeing how functional those people are with each other. No chiefs, gender equality, children have a voice. They're hunters, but they have a deep ecological sense. And the entire culture based around healing and conflict resolution. Because if you're hunting and gathering in an area where you're not the top predator, if you fragment as a group, if conflict within the group gets beyond a certain point, then the hyenas are going to get you all. So you actually have to stick together. So you have a healer who sits, or shaman healer, who sits at the middle of the culture, whose job it is to kind of constantly resolve conflict, not just heal physical ailments. And this is regarded as incredibly important. And I remember thinking, gosh, if this is how humans actually are, because this is the oldest culture on the planet, then that's actually a really good advertisement for our species. And it means that all of that stuff that we think of as normal human behavior, like war or organized violence or that sort of thing, it's not. Actually, it's an aberration, which is why we know it's wrong. And that's why we bother with having a justice system. And it seems to have all come in quite recently, like the last 10,000 years, with the domestication of plants and animals, agriculture, and owning stuff, and overpopulation and all these things. And it's driven us nuts. But it's not who we really are. And right at that time that happened, and I found out that this group of Bushmen in South Africa still existed, this group of Bushmen in South Africa instituted a land claim very similar to the one in Canada that I'd followed, where they said, we would like our land back, please. We were kicked out of that national park under apartheid, and they managed to find a lawyer. And I found out about this, and the journalist in me just went, oh my gosh, you have to follow this story. And then the personal side of me said, yeah, Rue, and this is where your non-white family used to operate and still do. I bet you there's a family connection to this story. So I dug a little further, and I found out that the Bushmen up there were actually being opposed in their land claim by another non-white group who said we were also displaced from this area, and why should they get the land? We want the land. And you know there was there's a kind of a conflict going on between these two groups who'd been displaced, and of course the national park was having none of it. I found out, of course, that the second group were cousins of mine. And then I found out that many of them had married into the group of Bushmen, and that therefore I was cousin-in-law to this group of Bushmen. So I went to find them and found their camp by the side of the road, sat with them, talked with them, and was immediately just taken in as family. Now, this group had been displaced, so I talked about a very beautiful life up there in Namibia with those Bushmen that I'd run into up there. But down here in South Africa, it was not like that, because they'd been displaced and victimized and predated upon in every way. And alcohol and drugs and all of that had crept in. This was the antithesis. Yet there was still something really gentle and beautiful and wounded about this group. And what they said to me is, Rue, we lost our healers. We lost our healing tradition when we lost the land. And we're now, it's almost pointless us getting the land back if we don't recover our healing tradition, because we'll just destroy ourselves. It's quite wise. And at the time, I was going then between there and Deepa Kalahari to write a book about these cultures, which eventually became a book called The Healing Land, which was published here and in the US, The Healing Land. And in the course of this, I became initiated into more and more into this healing tradition. And I got to see things that just boggle the mind. Hunting magic, in which the animal is brought to you. Shape shifting, in which the healer turns themselves into a leopard. Cancers being pulled out of people's bodies. I saw all this. It's all recounted in that book. And I'm not the only one. I mean, anyone who's spent any time, in a culture like that, they've all got their stories of this. And what you realize is that these kinds of miracles are actually the norm in human society, in true human society that's living in nature, that's living the old way, that's living close to animals and plants. We're supposed to live in, constant connection and relationship with up to about 300 species, in really supportive groups in which the predators are outside of the human thing, and the predator is never your fellow man. And now we've replaced that with no relationship with any other species, unless we're lucky enough to live on farms or whatever. And the predator is always our fellow man now. This sends us completely crazy. So I follow the land claim, and I help the group in South Africa to connect with the healers by their own request, to connect with the healers up in Botswana and Namibia. In fact, the group in South Africa, the Kamani they're called, said, well, Rue, you're a journalist. You've got to get us to the West so we can tell our story there. You've got to get us to the United Nations. And you've got to connect us with these healers up there. Oh, and it was your mother and your mother's stories about Africa, which largely kept Africa alive in your heart, even when you were a boy growing up in London. So you have to get your mother and bring her out here when we got to see the healers to dance for the land to be returned. And you got to get us to the UN. And remember that thing I talked about adventure. Sometimes when an adventure's in front of you and you feel this pull in your solar plexus, in your throat. I felt it in Canada that time. I felt it many times on the back of a horse going into a dangerous situation. I'd felt it, when you must take the adventure in front of you, even though you're scared. And so I said, okay, I'll try. And I had no idea how to do any of these things because it all costs a lot of money. I didn't, to set up expeditions or hire vehicles to get a load of people up into Botswana or get someone to the UN. How on earth do you do that? And what do you even do when you're at the UN? And get these people from Africa to, okay, I'll try. So I did. And I founded a nonprofit called the Indigenous Land Rights Fund. And we raised some money to begin to create a fund to bring a group from South Africa and a group from Botswana over to America and get to the UN. But while that was in the very early stages of development, my mum did come out and the Bushman stripped her naked. She was such a sport on the sand dunes in the area in South Africa, covered her with the sacred pollen called ngao. And then we sang songs to her and honored her. And then we went up into Botswana. And by then I had forged a relationship with a healer called Besa. And those of you who know my book about Rowan, my son, autistic son, know that his middle name is Besa. And I'd heard stories about Besa all over the Kalahari. And when I finally met him, living under a thorn tree in western Botswana, near a settlement called Huntsi, this man saw me, got up from where he was sitting, and went, "There are two Besas! Two! Two!" And he pointed himself. He went, "Oh, Besa! Oh, Besa! You, Klein Besa, little Besa." So I was always little Besa in the Kalahari. And those of you who know my website, the Long Ride Home website, know that we have a program on there called Little Besa about how to bring everyday shamanism into and healing into your life. And that's why it's called that, because that was the name I was given. And Besa was the one who showed me shape-shifting. Besa was the one who showed me a lot of the more extreme healing techniques. And the Bushmen in South Africa, when they heard that I found Besa, they said, this is the man we need. We've heard about him too. This is the man we need to dance for us to help us restore our own healing tradition and secure the land. So up we went and we held the healing. And it was a real anticlimax. I'd been at healings where there'd been high drama, healers bleeding from the mouth, from the eyes, from, as they pulled sickness out of people and diving into the fire and swallowing coals, and nothing like this. In fact, Besa turned up drunk. Danced for maybe, it's all done through dance, this healing, for maybe an hour and a half. And then that was it. And then the next day we had to drive out. And I said to David Kreper, who was the the sort of representative of the Bushman there in the land claim for South Africa. Do you think it was worth coming? Do you think it? And he looked at me and said, Rupert, Besa showed up drunk because I'm a drunk. He was showing me what I need to change in myself to make this happen. And he said, Rupert, a year from today, I'm going to sit down with the president of South Africa and I'm going to sign the land claim for half the national park. Would have been the largest land claim in African history. A year and a day, it was off by one day. A year and a day after that conversation, he did indeed sit down with the president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki at the time, and he signed the largest land claim in African history. Manifestation. Self-actualization. On the way back from that healing in Botswana to South Africa, we camped in a canyon on the Namibian border that had been part of the Khumani land ancestrally. And at 4 a.m, I was sleeping in the back of a pickup truck. I woke up bolt upright and saw what looked like a little white whirlwind, little white wind going like that across the canyon floor. And instinctively I thought, oh, that's death. And I just went back to sleep again. At the morning fire, making coffee, the lady who I was doing a lot of that work with, Belinda, she said, did you see that thing at about 4 o'clock this morning? And I said, yeah. I said, what do you think it was? She said, well, I think it was death. What do you think? I said, yeah, I think it's death too. And then David Creper comes along and says, did you guys see that thing at 4 a.m? And we both said, yeah, what do you think it was? Was it death? And he said, well, almost. He said it was a departing soul, because this is where we used to bury our dead in the ancestors before we lost all this land. And that's a soul returning from where we live now to here. When we get back to the village, we will find that somebody has died. And indeed, when we got back to the village, a whole day's drive later, we found that somebody had indeed died. So I got a real window on these parallel worlds and fields of consciousness and realities that exist all together. And right about that time, as the Bushmen in South Africa became successful with their land claim, a bigger threat to a larger group of Bushmen up in Botswana happened, where the Botswana government, with De Beers Diamonds, decided to kick another group off their land in order to make way for diamond mines. And this was the point at which they then said, could you help us too? And this is the point at which we decided, okay, this UN thing, we need to see if we can make that. Okay, so how to get this delegation of San Bushman hunter-gatherers who have no power at all, who are being put in jail and tortured, this is up in Botswana, if they go up against the government in any way. And me, this freelance journalist with no backing private funds, I have no organization behind me, no big newspaper, no nothing, I'm just a freelancer. What to do?
As you may know, if you've been following my work, we are also horsey folk here. And we have been training horses for many, many years in the manner of the old classical dressage masters. This is something which is often very confusing for people. We shine a light on that murky, difficult stuff and make it crystal clear. If you'd like to learn to train your horse in the manner of the old masters and really have fun and joy for you and your equine, go to our website, heliosharmony.com, sign up as a premium member and begin to take the Helios Harmony course, which will take you from zero to the piaffe, where the horse is dancing on the spot, in hand, on the ground. And then from there, you can develop out to anywhere you want to. heliosharmony.com to unlock the secrets of the old masters.
Well, I published this book, The Healing Land. So I thought by this point, okay, maybe I could use that as a bit of a platform. So I go to a big independent bookstore in the US and I say, can I do a book talk? And they say, yeah. And I think, well, maybe. So this costs me about $500 that I don't really have to put on. And by now I'm also a new parent. And 5 people show up to my talk. Okay. Then I find that there's an actual department in the United Nations, a sort of private group attached to the United Nations that have their office in the United Nations Tower in New York, who deal with exactly this type of issue. So I contact them and they give me an audience, and I walk into this boardroom and I've got Rowan, I don't know it at the time, but autistic child in a baby Bjorn around my neck, and I make a case. I tell them what's going on, and they say, yeah, we know that they're all being kicked off their land in the Kalahari. There's nothing we can do about it. You have no power. You have no clout. So, hippie like you, no way is there anything going to work. And they laugh at me, and they kick me out. They kick me out of the office. Like, okay, what do I do now? Right about then is when autism comes into my life like a hurricane, like a tsunami. And I'm just beginning to come to grips with what this is going to mean for me. And I'm living in Austin, Texas by now, driving to a early therapy appointment with my son, wondering, panicking, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Autism. And I get a phone call. And the phone call is from someone who says, you don't know who I am, but a friend of mine was at that talk that you did at that bookstore. And they've talked to me and I've researched what you were talking about. And I believe that this is indeed something worth backing. And tell me what your budget is that you need. So I told her, she said, I'm going to give you a third of it. And when you go out to raise money, tell everybody that I and my organization are backing this, and you'll probably get the rest of the money. I'd never met or heard of this person ever before. And I did, and we raised the money. And in most people's fundraising terms, it wasn't a lot. It was about 100,000, which was to hopefully cover not just bringing a group of Bushmen to the USA, but also helping them begin a legal process. But the legal process in Botswana was going to have to be in their own high court. And because this area that they had been kicked out from had actually been given to them under British rule in perpetuity. So, and it had been written into the constitution of the Botswana government. So the Botswana government now going against their own constitution. But the judge in this case was going to be, of course, a cousin of the president. So what with, and all with the billions and billions of De Beers diamonds behind them. So what to do? Well, we did everything. I managed to make contact with a group called Journey to the Heart, who ran something called the Gathering of the Shamans every year in California, healers from all over the world. And I managed to get that group to formally invite the Bushmen over and raise some money also to be part of their, against part of their travel. And then partly through the same organization, we managed to make contact with an organization called Artists for Amnesty, which was the like Hollywood wing of Amnesty International, and they got behind it. And we managed to get, by hook and by crook, Dave Matthews. Those of you who were around during the 90s may remember that Dave Matthews was the kind of the big singer-songwriter of that era. Don't hear about him anymore, but he was huge back then. Him and Jackson Browne to host a party in Hollywood for the Bushman. And this went out to news outlets and so on. And it was a, big do. We got the Bushman over. We're in California. And then we go around after this, we go do everything we can. The Bushmen, a lot of them ride really well, hunt kudu off horses with spears. So I took them fox hunting with, there's packs of hounds in California and on the East Coast in America. And, you get lots of like high powered lawyers and people like that out with these hunts. So I thought maybe if I take them there, they can network. And they did. And they of course rode incredibly well. Everyone was, impressed. And then next thing you know, we have some lawyers coming forward saying, hey, I'll represent you pro bono. And we then went from there across to the Navajo reservation. We thought we'd go from the West Coast to the East Coast. Navajo reservation's on the way, and the Hopi reservation, to talk to groups of Native Americans to talk about, well, what do you do with the land when you've got it back? There are, going to be their own sets of challenges then. So we are camping in Canyon de Chelly, which is the second biggest canyon in the USA after the Grand Canyon in Arizona on the Navajo reservation. And we're talking with the Navajo about, land stewardship and how it all works for them and so on. While we're camping, a medicine man shows up and he says, hey, I hear you guys are here to get the land back for these people. Would you like me to do a ceremony, a sweat healing for that? And we said, yeah, of course. So we do, and we do these rounds of prayers for the return of the land. And at the end of it, the healer says, has anyone else got anything that they want to ask for healing for? And I said, yeah, my son's just been diagnosed with autism and it's really severe and I don't know what to do. So we do a round of prayers for that. And as we're cooling down after the sweat, the healer comes to me and says, do you hunt? I said, yeah, I do, but maybe not in a way that you're familiar with. And he said, yeah, well, that's not important. He said, but I'm just getting it loud and clear from the spirit world that you have to stop. And it's somehow connected with your son's autism. And I thought, of course, this thing that I love doing, fox hunting, was such a huge part of my life. And it was one of the great early loves. And even though it was so morally ambiguous, it's such a madly beautiful, pagan, dangerous, incredible thing to do. And I actually, used to write for the equestrian press and go around with these different hunts and hunt. And of course, this is going to be taken from me. Of course, I must give this up. Makes perfect sense. So I said, okay, I'll do it. I'll do it. And I had to tell a friend of mine who was the head of the Masters of Foxhounds Association in America about this, because he and I were working quite closely together. And when I did tell him, he said, oh, Rupert, I knew you'd always turn on us, you bloody hippie. You always, I knew you'd turn into an anti. And I said, look, it's got nothing to do with that. It's just a personal decision. It's based, of this weird shamanic thing. I don't know what to tell you. And as I'm having this conversation with him on the phone, I was briefly back home. It was at night, sitting on my porch, the porch light threw out a light into my front field. And as I'm talking to him, a fox comes walking out of the dark into that porch light. And about 25 feet away from me, just stops and just starts barking, going, well, I'm on the phone. This guy, I'd put the phone up like this and say, can you hear that? And he's like, yes. I'm like, well, that's what's going on while I'm having this conversation with you. He's like, okay, well, maybe something is going on, as you say. So And one of the things that the Bushman had really taught me was always, always, always look for what wildlife is showing you. When wildlife shows up in your path, it's the ancestors talking to you. Then keep your ears open. Ask, what are you here to tell me? And this is an important thing. Okay. All right. So we get now to the East Coast and we get to the UN. Finally, we find ourselves there in the United Nations and we testify before Congress, for the Human Rights Commissions, and we do all these things. But what really makes a difference is that we get to the State Department. And when we walk into the State Department, what is weird is there's pictures on the wall, blown up pictures of the war of Indigenous peoples. And among them are portraits of my friends in South Africa, some of whom are on this delegation, because it's half Bushman from Botswana, half from South Africa. What are the odds of that? And we walk into an office, we're shown to an office, and the guy who's dealing with us in the State Department is Apache Indian. He says, I grew up on the reservation. I know exactly what's going on with you. And right in front of us, he picks up the telephone, calls the land minister in Botswana and says, I've got 4 guys sitting in here in my office saying they've been tortured, for protesting illegal evictions from their land. You're supposed to be an ally of ours. What's going on? And that was something that began the game change. Well, it wasn't the end of the road by any means, but it pushed us over the line. And that happened through the help of an organization called First Nations Development Institute, run by an amazing woman called Rebecca Adamson, who's Lumbee Indian and who helped us massively. It was her contacts that got us there. For the next 2 to 3 years, we just kept it up. We managed to get through Artists for Amnesty. The Bushman invited back across to California to be at the premiere of the Blood Diamond movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, and Morgan Freeman is there and so on. And we're protesting outside the De Beers Diamonds shop in Fifth Avenue, New York, and we're doing everything we can. And we're protesting in London as well through an amazing organization there called Survival International. And we're helping the lawyer and helping to raise money, interestingly, through the fox hunting world. It was the fox hunting world that really came out and donated money for the lawyers for the Bushmen. And there are many, many little sub-stories to be told in this. But suffice to say that these lawyers began to go out to Botswana, which is where the new land claim is being fought, which is an even bigger area at stake than the South African one, rather similar to the one in Quebec. It's the size of a European country. It's about the size of Belgium or Switzerland. This area called the Central Kalahari Game Reserve. There are only about 3,500 people living in it. And the Botswana government saying, we've got to displace you all to make way for diamond mines. No way. I mean, we could say, look, there's lots of people in Belgium and Switzerland, millions of people, and they have mines and no one needs to be displaced. The Bushmen aren't even asking for money. They just don't want to be kicked off their land. And eventually I managed to get, again, through Artists for Amnesty, invited to a get together of Nobel Peace Prize laureates in Rome. And there are, in the room, it's Mikhail Gorbachev, it's Sting, it's Bob Geldof, it's, even though they're not laureates, Lech Walesa, Jose Ramos Horta from East Timor, all these amazing people. Bishop Tutu, Desmond Tutu. And they hear me out and they write a joint letter to the Botswana government saying, let these people alone. And then I also managed to get Gloria Steinem, who's the sort of godmother of feminism in the USA, and Abby Disney, who's Walt Disney's granddaughter, and Warren Buffett's daughter-in-law. This all came in through Artists for Amnesty to come out on a safari to Botswana, to this disputed area. And while we're there with the Bushmen, the Botswana government come in with troops armed, and they kick us out. And it's a big international embarrassment because these are big cheeses that they've done this to. And then finally, the court case is going on, the court case is going on, the court case is going on. About 2005, early 2006, the prosecutor on behalf of the government in Botswana does something monumentally stupid. He has an indiscretion with the wife of the judge. And suddenly, just despite the fact that they're all cousins in the same noble family, suddenly it becomes personal. And the judge rules in favor of the Bushman against all odds. Now, I realized what was happening with these lawyers that was going up to Botswana was that the lawyers were briefing the community, and the community were then going and relaying this to their healers, and the healers were going into the spirit world and getting a series of instructions there and coming from the ancestors and coming back out and briefing the community, who were then briefing the lawyers. And what we kept getting from the healers was, keep hanging on, keep hanging on, keep hanging on. Something unexpected will happen. Well, something unexpected did happen. And the Bushman won the largest land claim in African history again. I didn't even expect to win. When people were asking me, Rupert, why are you devoting so much of your life to this? What happens if you don't win? Like your ego will collapse, and and I was like, you got me completely wrong. I'm in it for the crack. I'm in it for the adventure. I will give it my best shot. But I'm in it because the adventure has called me. The ancestors have called me. If it doesn't work out, well, how lucky and fortunate and privileged was I to be part of an adventure like this? But I have a gut feeling that we will be successful. And indeed, it happened. I was lying on my couch in Texas, exhausted from a series of autism tantrums, still at the early stages of wondering what to do, but beginning to find my way with that a bit. And I got a call from the BBC in London saying, can we have a comment? And I'm like, on what? And they said, well, you've won. I said, we've won what? This is, the Bushman case. You're involved, can we have a statement from you? I'm like, yeah, the statement is beep, beep, bleep, 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 just because I was so surprised. And that did not conclude my journey in the Kalahari. But my focus at that point then could shift completely to my son, whose autism was so severe, nonverbal, incontinent, tantruming. Now, I tried all the orthodox therapies. They didn't work. So the journalist in me said, well, you know what you don't know, which is you don't know what to do here. You need mentorship, someone to show you. None of these therapists that you're reaching out to seem to really know what they're doing. If there's going to be a mentor, who's that mentor? What qualities must that mentor have? And I thought, well, that mentor needs to be autistic, adult autistic, who started life in the same place as my son, incontinent, tantruming, that sort of thing, self-harming, unable to make friends, nonverbal, and has somehow made it. Who's that person? And I realized actually that person exists. That's Dr. Temple Grandin. She's a well-known autistic author and neuroscientist and professor of animal sciences. And why don't I contact her? Because she was nonverbal, wiping her poo on the wall, age 3, and they were going to institutionalize her, but she found her way. How did she find her way? So I asked her for an interview. And I went up and talked to her. And when I went into her office, she was stimming and doing, the repetitive movements and behaviors and like really autistic. And I was like, oh my gosh, you can be like that and still be like totally successful. And so I said, how does my son become you? And she said, Rupert, do three things. Follow the child, follow their interests, follow what upsets them and avoid that, and follow what makes them happy and go with that. Follow them physically so that you can observe what they get into. Follow them intellectually, check out their obsessions, and just go down those rabbit holes. Do your stuff outside as much as you can, because there's no bad sensory triggers in nature, because that's where our organism is supposed to be. And your son, like most people on the spectrum, has an oversensitive nervous system that's triggering his amygdala all the time, his fight, flight, freeze, filling himself with cortisol, stress hormones, so he can't learn, he's unreachable. But in nature, this will be less. And let him move. Don't confine him to desks, chairs, therapy rooms. Do your stuff out in nature where he can move, because he's a kinetic learner, kinesthetic learner. Whew, that made sense. I said, well, anyway, look, if that's resulted in you, let me try that. So I went home and I did. And those of you who know my story know that that resulted in me following him to a horse called Betsy, and him becoming verbal on that horse, and me realizing that it was in certain rhythms that he was verbal, and that those rhythms, if I reproduced them, I got more speech. And we lived in the saddle together for 3 or 4 years, and I was so broke. And he became verbal, literate, and numerate in about 18 months. And then I thought, okay, is it just him or is it other children too? So I started throwing unofficial play dates on the farm for other kids on the spectrum, and they started having the same result. And then I had to homeschool him because the local school, the special ed department, was not good. And I thought, well, if I can use these rhythms and feed in information on the horse, what about off the horse? So what about on my shoulders? What about on a yoga ball? What about on a swing? What about on play equipment? And I did that and it worked. And then I got curious and I went to neuroscientists and said, please, can you explain why it's working? And I got a similar explanation from quite a few, saying, yeah, what's happening is you're creating oxytocin through hip rocking, rhythmic hip rocking. Oxytocin is a feel-good hormone that's calming down this oversensitive nervous system. It's also a communication hormone. Makes us communicate. Oh, and it's switching off the amygdala, telling it to stop producing cortisol, which is giving you access to the intellect. And then because the kid is moving and problem solving all the time, that creates neuroplasticity. That creates a protein in the brain called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, that's basically like miracle grow for the brain. And in these billions of brain cells that are being produced are these ones of particular interest called Purkinje cells that, among many other things, govern social skills. So you're taking a kid with autoism, auto Greek word for the selfism, filling him with a soothing to the nervous system communication hormone. For someone who doesn't want to communicate, they're now fooled with a communication hormone. And social skills, brain cells, you're going to see change. And we went, oh my gosh, yes, you can. That means we can replicate this. So we began teaching people how to do this with horses, and that became something called horseboy method. And do this without horses, and that became movement method. And then how to train the horse how to do this as its own therapy for adults with trauma. Remember back to when I'd had all that PTSD and I'd been out in Africa and I'd been out with those horses and it had all sort of gone away. That had never left me. Now I understood the neuroscience and I realized, yeah, we could pair up veterans, first responders, adult autists, people who've suffered abuse, and help them to train the horses like this. And sure enough, it turned out to be its own therapy. And that's called Takhin, Takhin, equine integration, these 3 programs. And in the course of this, I had to learn a lot of dressage. So we ended up teaching a lot of dressage as well and running this from this ranch in Texas. Meanwhile, that word Takhin, Takhin, it's actually a Mongolian word. It means the wild horse, the Przewalski's horse. It was never domesticated. It means honored one or revered one. I always liked that word because I felt that as a rider, as someone who works with horses, I like the idea of honoring the horse's wild nature. And those of you who know my story know that I also did something rather crazy. Having seen that my son had this amazing response to the horse and having this background in this shamanic healing with the Bushman, I wondered if there was a place that combined these two things on earth. And so, yeah, that's Mongolia. Gut feeling again, that scent, that pull at the solar plexus, got to go there. So I did. And I wrote a book about it called The Horse Boy and made a documentary about it called The Horse Boy. And this is back in, we put out the first little proposal about maybe doing it when YouTube was very young in 2005. We made the journey in 2007. And it went viral. It's one of the first things that ever went viral. I think the ancestors were at work. And a book deal resulted that was big enough to not just fund the expedition and make the movie, but also for us to open up a therapy center doing horseboy method and movement method. And that book, The Horseboy, if you've read it or if you've seen the film, you'll know that we ended up at the end of it with the reindeer people in southern Siberia, where it borders on the steppes in northern Mongolia. And the healer of the reindeer people, Ghost, 2 days after doing the healings on Rowan, Rowan did his first intentional poo and cleaned himself, which was like watching England win the World Cup. And he said to me, you have to do 3 more journeys to confirm it. So in 2008, I went back out to the Bushman, and Besa came and healed my son. But we had to do it in Namibia because after we had helped the Bushman win the land claim in 2006, I and a group of 16 journalists and human rights workers had been banned from Botswana. Can't go back. It's like winning an award. So we had to do it in the neighboring country, Namibia, and get a passport organized for Besa, who lived under a tree. You can imagine how that was not a straightforward process, so that he could come across into Namibia, sorry, and heal his namesake, my son, Rowan Besa Isaacson. And he did, along with another legendary healer called Unta from the Jinkwazi Bushman in Namibia, a beautiful man, and his friend Wee. These 3 healers collaborated on my son over 3 days. And then the year after that, we were in the Daintree rainforest in Queensland with a Kuku-Yalanji shaman from the Aboriginal Kuku-Yalanji people there. And the year after that on the Navajo reservation. Remember, we'd been there before. That's where with the Bushman, where I'd been made to give up hunting. And at the end of each of these healings, there was a massive leap forward. And I tell that story in a book called The Long Ride Home. And now here I sit talking to you. My son is now 23. He is independent. He just came out of the bath in the other room there. He travels all over by himself. He has his own house, his own car, couple of jobs. He's doing very well. He's got 2 younger siblings now, Kieran and Freya, who are both a source of great annoyance and a source of great joy to him, just as all siblings should be. And we continue to do this work now in about 40 countries, serving, I can't count how many families through these methods, and also the parallel horse training. And I still write books and make films and so on. So that's a sort of potted version of my story of self-actualization. I think what really comes out for me with it is that what really makes self-actualization happen is when it's about service somehow. The horses brought me out of my depression as a child and brought me into nature. And I had to earn my way to them, running that market stall and stuff. They really also served me so generously and have ever since. And then I got involved in service with first the Cree and then with the Bushman. And then, of course, with autism. And I think many of you can probably trace parallels in your own lives that service seems to be at the key here. So I want to leave you with this, and some of you have heard me say this before. There can be no real happiness, I think, unless one is in service to one's community, and that is how we're wired, because we're hunter-gatherers. We're supposed to be constantly looking out for each other. In our current society, we've been told we need to be in competition with each other, and it brings us misery. However, if you are in service, it is exhausting. There's no question it's exhausting. So how do you not burn out? Well, the people that you serve, or the planet, if you're serving the planet, acts as a shamanic prism for your dreams. Because if your dreams are put into the service of the dreams of people more vulnerable than yourself, then your own dreams start to come true. And this is done because this will stop you from burning out. This is what will allow you to keep getting up day after day, year after year, to do the work. And in my position as an autism dad, I can never stop. In fact, even beyond the grave, I have to set up structures for Rowan. And so I can't burn out. I can't fail. But my dreams of horses and writing and living free and riding free are tied up in service to him and people like him. And also to some degree with human rights and the ecological offshoots of human rights, Indigenous rights. So here's the deal, guys. If you put your dreams into the service of the dreams of people more vulnerable than yourself, then your dreams will start to come true. You may have forgotten what your dreams are. You may have pushed them away, because a lot of us have this experience. Here's a dream. Life comes along and takes a big poo all over it and then stomps on it and buries it. And this breaks our hearts. But actually the dream didn't go anywhere. It just got fertilized and planted. And now it requires moisture, blood, sweat, tears, and up it comes. So what I want to leave you with, my friends, is what are your dreams? Just this question, what are your dreams? And if you have forgotten, you've pushed them away, just asking yourself the question is enough, because then you'll push your subconscious, and in an unguarded moment, 36 hours or so after you ask yourself that question, you'll be sitting in traffic with your mind wandering or on the loo, and it will go bubble, bubble, ping, and you'll go, oh yes, that was it. That dream. And then almost immediately you'll push it away again, but I can't have it. But actually this time you can. The rules are different. If in fact, you must, in fact, you will, that's the contract with God. That's the contract with the universe. If you put that dream out there and you say very clearly that you want to put that dream, you will put that dream into the service of the dreams of people more vulnerable than yourself, then I look forward to hearing your feedback, particularly a year maybe after watching this or listening to this, and telling me how those dreams are starting to come true. So, what are your dreams? You listening right now, you watching right now, what are your dreams? What are your dreams? And that, my friends, is all I've got. Till next time.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. If you did, please help us to make more. Please like, subscribe, tell a friend, give us a thumbs up. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, please go to my website, rupertisaacson.com. And if you'd like to find out about our certification courses with autism, education, horsemanship, everyday shamanism, there's a whole range of cool stuff. Putting a show together like this is not an easy task. If you'd like to support us, please consider going to our Patreon page and showing us some love there. Even the smallest donation, it really helps us to keep the good content coming. So go to rupertisaacson.com and click on the Patreon link. Not to mention our excellent merch. Please go to our shop and check out some of our really cool rock and roll themed merch, t-shirts, hoodies, all that sort of thing. rupertisaacson.com, it's all there. I can't wait for our next guest and also to meet you there. In the meantime, remember, live free, ride free.